All right. Let's go ahead and jump into this tonight. So as a review a little bit on Sunday, in getting into chapter 1, we see that Nahum is prophesying that God is going to destroy Nineveh. This book is very interesting to me in going through it, because in chapter 1 you have the prophecy that this is going to happen. Chapter 2, we're going to get into the details of the destruction. And then chapter 3 is God telling them, and this is why I'm doing this to you. So it's really kind of made very clear for the people of Nineveh what's going to happen and why it's going to happen. So tonight we're going to go through chapters 2 and 3. Hopefully we'll get through all of that, and hopefully maybe get to a couple of the questions on that sheet. But just jumping into this, let's look at chapter 2, and we're going to start out with just the first 2 verses, 1 and 2. All right. Let me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. Okay, 13. Remember that. 13. Okay. Verses 1 and 2. He who scatters has come up before your face. Man the fort. Watch the road. Strengthen your flanks. Fortify your power mightily. For the Lord will restore the excellence of Jacob like the excellence of Israel. For the emptiers have emptied them out and ruined their vine branches. 14. So we see in these first 2 verses God talking to the people of Nineveh, and saying, hey, restoration of his people in this process. So Nineveh is going to be destroyed, and yet the people of God are going to come back out of this. All right? And then going on, let's look at verses 3 through 5. And Bryce, read 3 through 5, please.
Okay. The shields of his warriors are dyed red. The valiant men are dressed in scarlet. The fittings of the chariot flash like fire on the day of its battle preparations, and the spears are brandished. The chariots dash madly through the streets. They rush around in the plazas. They look like torches. They dart back and forth like lightning. He gives orders to his officers. They stumble as they advance. They race to its wall. The protective shield is set in place.
So we can see in these verses that God's people had been beaten down by these Assyrian aggressors, and that for their actions, the people of Nineveh are going to be overrun by an enemy army. That what they have done to the people of God, they are now going to get to experience that themselves, and they are going to be taken over. Any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns, whatever on the first 5 verses? Anybody? Bryce? Yeah.
The first couple of verses about God saying what he's going to do. You pointed out that God's saying, telling them what he's going to do.
Yeah.
But that they also have a part in that. He's telling them to prepare for it. So it's not just sitting back and letting God do all the work. There's a call to action along with it.
Yeah, but it's true. It's interesting, though, that call to action is to the people of Nineveh, that they have their part in this, and yet he is very clearly telling them, you need to prepare for this, but you're still going to be destroyed. So, that, he's quite clear. Thank you.
Okay, as I remarked in the Sunday class, is that just even God just saying you're going to be destroyed is still a last warning to avert the coming destruction. We even just have to look over at Jonah's story to see that all Jonah goes and says is 40 days Nineveh is going to be destroyed. It doesn't give them any hope that they can avert the destruction, and yet they still turn and repent. And so this is in effect a final warning. You can still turn this away. I'm just letting you know it's not going to be pretty if you don't.
Yeah. You know, and what a contrast here from Jonah, in that when you look there, what a response the people of Nineveh had at that time. You know, and here it is, you know, over 100 years later, so just a few generations later, and there's no, you know, response, you know, other than to flee. You know, they don't have that turning moment like we saw them have in the book of Jonah. So getting into verses 6 through 13, we're going to see the specific destruction that God does to Nineveh. So looking at verse 6. So the gates of the rivers are opened, and the palace is dissolved. So the city was flooded, and the palace dissolved here. So the Hudson River ran right through the city of Nineveh. And like we said during the Jonah class, Nineveh was on the east side of the Tigris River. So it's not hard to see how that would have been easy, you know, for that to be possible, for the city to be flooded. I mean, you know, you have, you know, the Tigris, a big river on the east side, and another river running right through the city. I mean, so how easy would that be for God to flood the city? You know, however he deemed to do that. Then let's look at 7 through 10. James, will you read 7 through 10, please?
It is decreed, she shall be led away captive, she shall be brought up, and her maidservants shall lead her as with the voice of doves, beating their breast. Though Nineveh of old was like a pool of water, now they flee away. Halt, halt, they cry, but no one turns back. Take spoil of silver, take spoil of gold. There is no end treasure, or wealth desirable prize. Where to?
10. One more. Yeah, thanks, man.
She is empty, desolate, and waste. The heart melts and the knees shake. Much pain is in every side, and all their faces are drained of color. So,
you know, in these verses, we see that the inhabitants of Nineveh are going to be carried away. It's going to be the Chaldean army that would be coming against them, and that they would not show them any mercy here. You know, in verse 9, verse 8, you know, where, you know, they're like, halt, halt, they cry. You know, how easy is that for us to picture in our minds? You know, all of us have been in situations where we need help, you know, where we need somebody to do something for us, you know, and in that moment where you're like, oh, stop, you know, can you do this? They do that, and they don't have that help. They don't have that assistance. You know, people are letting them be, you know, and then, you know, verses 9 and 10, you know, they have all this wealth. You know, Nineveh was a city where they had so many alliances with other nations, you know, for all of their things, we'll say, you know, imports, exports, all of that. And none of those people will be doing anything for them. You know, they would be emptied of their silver, their gold, all of their wealth. It's going to be gone. So they will end up with nothing, you know, in this destruction. Somebody read verses 11 through 13, please.
Where is the lion's den, the feeding place of the young lions? Where the lion and lioness went, where his cubs were, with none to disturb. The lion tore enough for his cubs and strangled prey for his lionesses. See what? I hate that word. He filled his caves with prey and his dens with torn flesh. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will burn your chariots in smoke, and the sword shall devour your young lions. I will cut off your prey from the earth, and the voice of your messengers shall no longer be heard.
You know, it's interesting that both figuratively and literally, you know, the lion was representative of Nineveh. That is a description of their army, and there were literally lions there that they used in as far as killing and torturing and all that. And yet we see that the Assyrian army was about to be destroyed. I mean, they were going to be nothing against this army, the Chaldean army that was coming against them. And how complete the destruction of Nineveh was, so complete that its exact whereabouts were completely unknown until 1843, when the ruins were discovered by 2 explorers. Don't ask me who those explorers are, I don't know. But that, you think from when that city was destroyed to when the ruins were discovered, that's well over 1,000 years. I mean, it's just, God was so complete in this with these people that they were done. All right, any questions, comments, anything on chapter 2 before we jump into chapter 3? No? All right, let's look at chapter 3. And would somebody read the first 3 verses of chapter 3 for me, please? Would you be that somebody? I'll just make it easier.
Woe to the city of blood, totally deceitful, full of plunder, never without fray. The crack of the whip and rumble of the wheel, galloping horse and jolting chariot, charging horsemen, flashing sword, shining spear, heaps of slain, mounds of corpses, dead bodies without end. They stumble over the dead.
So the city of Nineveh was completely built on bloodshed and violence, and they very much had a mindset of might makes right. That use of bloodshed continued throughout their entire existence. And these verses are saying that they're going to be held accountable for those actions. Her prey never departs. They were continually at war. That was just a part of their culture. And we see it in those verses 2 and 3, such a good description of the reality of that war that they were always in. Bryce, are you?
Yeah, I'm glad that we're covering this after Jonah. I think it's helpful to look at them together, because I think it'd be easy for us to look at this and say, well, obviously Jonah was right. God shouldn't have spared them, because they just went right back to doing what they were doing in the first place. The whole prophecy that Jonah was supposed to give them about they're going to be destroyed for their wickedness is the same thing here. But God wasn't wrong in sparing them. But it would just be so easy for us to think that God was wrong, Jonah was right. They just went right back into it.
Sure.
But it shows exactly who Jonah was upset with God for being, exactly who he is, of mercy and faithfulness and giving second chances. That's who God is.
That's interesting. One of the things that I thought about as I was going through this and preparing for this, we're told in Scripture that the next generation is weaker than the one before. And God doesn't tell us that because that has to be that way. That's a warning for us. That if we don't want that next generation to be weaker than the one before it, it's our responsibility to teach them. It's our responsibility to ensure that they know the Lord, that they are obedient to the Lord. This is what, it's like 110 years. So what is that, about 5 generations from Jonah? And you look at that in just 5 generations where these people have come to, and I think all of us would say we don't want that for the generations after us. So what are we doing now to ensure our next generation knows the Lord, loves the Lord, is obedient to the Lord, that is the center of who they are? But is that the center of who we are? It is serving the Lord everything that we're trying to do? Are we showing that throughout our life? We can see here, this is definitely not what these people were doing. Would somebody read 4 through 6, please?
I'll do it.
Thank you.
All because of the many harlotries of the harlot, the charming one, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations by her harlotries, and families by her sorceries. Behold, I am against you, declares the Lord of hosts, and I will lift up your skirts over your face, and show to the nations your nakedness, and to the kingdoms your disgrace. I will throw filth on you, and make you vile, and set you up as a spectacle.
When we see that, especially in verse 4, because of the multitude of harlotries, of the seductive harlot, the mistress of sorceries, who sells nations through her harlotries and families through her sorceries, their punishment from God is completely justified. It's not like they're going to be able to sit back and say, well, what did we do? Was anything we did that bad? No. It was horrid. At the end of verse 6, I will cast abominable filth upon you, make you vile, and make you a spectacle. That these were a wretched people. And God was going to bring them utter shame in their destruction because of the kind of people that they were. All right. In verse 7, it shall come to pass that all who look upon you will flee from you and say, Nineveh is laid waste. Who will bemoan her? Where shall I seek comforters for you? No one was going to be there to pity them. All would flee from them. Interesting that Nineveh was at one time such a place of social standing where this is where people would go. This is where they would go for all the things, to be seen and be a part of culture and life and all of that. And like I said earlier, they had created all these alliances, for trading and their imports and exports. And now none of these places would help them. None of them were going to mourn them. They would leave them. The city of Nineveh, the Assyrians would have nobody to stand behind them. No one's going to have their back, as we so often say. Can somebody read verses 8 through 10, please? Anybody?
Are you better than Nahum, that was situated by the river, that had the waters around her, whose rampart was the sea, whose wall was the sea, Ethiopia, Egypt, and her strength? And it was boundless. Put and Lebanon were your helpers. But she was carried away. She went into captivity. Her young children also were dashed into pieces at the head of every street. They cast lots for her honorable men, and all her great men were bound in chains. You say 11:2?
Just that. Thank you. So no Ammon. We might recognize that more as Thebes, which is a city in Egypt. The Assyrians had conquered Thebes at one time, and they were now being told they would be destroyed the same way that they had taken Thebes and destroyed that city. And to look in these verses, excuse me. Verse 10, it shows us the violence that these people did to other nations when they took them. So the violence that they did to Thebes at this time. Her young children were also dashed into pieces. As the head of every street, they cast lots for her honorable men, and her great men were bound in chains. These are the things that the Assyrians did to other nations when they conquered them. And so again, we can see the why God is destroying these people, why he did this, and how justified that was. And then let's look at 11 through 13. You also will be drunk, you will be hidden. You also will seek refuge from the enemy. All your strongholds are fig trees with ripened figs. If they are shaken, they fall into the mouth of the eater. Surely your people in your midst are women. The gates of your land are wide open for your enemies. Fire shall devour the bars of your gates. So, though Nineveh was such a great city, they're easily going to be overtaken. It's, all the preparation that God told them to do, all that isn't going to mean anything. Their strongholds would come down as easily, what it says, all of their people are going to be as women. I think in our culture today, that's probably an idea that people would not look on too favorably, because somebody's going to shout out, "You're saying women are weak." And I don't think that's what is being said here, but that they are not as strong as men. I think physically we've seen that throughout history, and that that's how all the people in Nineveh are going to be. Would somebody read 14 and 15, please?
Oh.
Thank you.
Draw your water for the siege, fortify your strongholds. Go into the clay and tread the mortar. Make strong the brick kiln. For the fire will devour you, the sword will cut you off. It will eat you up like locusts. Make yourself many like the locusts. Make yourself many like the swarming locusts.
So, though they would work to fortify their strongholds, it's going to be in vain. It's not going to mean anything to them. They can do this to prepare themselves, and it's not going to mean anything. Verse 15, their fire will consume you. The sword will cut you down. It will consume you as the locust does. And these people are going to have a very clear picture in their mind of what locusts can do to destroy an area. That is, it's complete during that season, and they will know exactly what that means. Any thoughts, questions, whatever up till here? No? All right. And then verses 16 and 17. You have multiplied your merchants more than the stars of heaven. The locust plunders and flies away. Your commanders are like swarming locusts, and your generals like the great grasshoppers, which camp in the hedges on a cold day. When the sun rises, they flee away, and the place where they are is not known. So even though they had these alliances throughout the known world, no one is going to be there for them. They are on their own. Their commerce is going to very quickly stop, and they would be helpless completely against their enemy. Right? And then the last two verses, Thane, would you read 18 and 19, please, sir?
King of Assyria, your shepherds slumber, your officers sleep. Your people are scattered across the mountains with no one to gather them together. There is no remedy for your injury. Your wound is severe.
So the king of Assyria is going to be powerless. He's mortally wounded, and all who fled would eventually be destroyed. Those who fled, that would be in 609, and it would be by Nebuchadnezzar. And the rest of the world would clap in celebration that Nineveh and Assyria had completely been brought down. When you think about that, how complete was the destruction of this place? And yet the rest of the world would do nothing but rejoice that these people were gone, that this place was gone. Any thoughts, questions, anything on that? All right. So looking at the questions that I gave you, so what are your all's thoughts on God using foreign nations as a tool to chastise his people for their rebellion? You know, and are there lessons in that we can learn for our generation? Thing.
I think all throughout the Bible, we see these moments where God uses very suspect elements, very morally suspect elements, in order to achieve his ends. I mean, one just has to take a look at most of the stories in the book of the Judges, where there are almost every one of those judges go astray in some way, and God, and yet God still descends upon them and empowers them to do whatever it is he needs them to do. That is not equivalent to his endorsement for them. And more often than not, those that God uses in order to achieve his ends, even though they are wicked in some degree, he doesn't allow them to escape without some kind of punishment. Just as, I mean, in the very next book we have Habakkuk, who it discusses this question entirely of how can God use bad things to achieve a good end.
Yeah.
Just, these people are going to come in, they are going to punish the Israelites, though the Israelites are the term more righteous than these Babylonians is a subjective remark, I believe. But God says, don't worry, they will have their own punishment too, but this is what I need to do my job.
Right.
I think a lot of people in our nation specifically, it's easy for us to kind of become prone to the idea that just because, well, the false idea that the righteous will always win over the wicked, right? In every single circumstance here, whether it's, I mean, that can be in things as little as games, like cheaters shouldn't win kind of ideas that we have. And even leading us to think that, oh, because our nation is powerful, that means we're righteous, which is not necessarily the case. I mean, it's certainly not for Chaldea, the Babylonians who are taking over Assyria,
Yeah.
because they're about to be taken over too, because they're just as wicked. And that was Habakkuk's problem. Well, how can you use Babylon? So we got to be careful that we don't think, oh, just because we're favored by God because we're doing well. Well, Assyria was doing well, Babylon was doing well.
Yeah. And then they weren't.
It doesn't mean you're righteous.
Yeah. Yeah. Phil.
I think all through the Old Testament, you see the people of Israel, their faith is reinforced whenever they see God working in their lives. And then when he doesn't work in their lives, they start drifting away. And then they start playing the harlot and following other countries' gods and living their lives the way they want to. And then when they see it like a judge comes in there and he's like Samson, he starts taking care of business, and then they see God working in their lives again. But I think it's just up and down. They're strong and they're weak.
I mean, it is. I mean, we see that cycle that the Israelites go through, you know, where they are a faithful people to the Lord. And like Phil said, you know, then they don't see God working in their lives and they quickly fall, you know, they quickly turn, you know, and I think we can see that today. You know, I think culturally, you know, I'm saying that very specifically, culturally, people will look at our nation and almost think like, oh, well, we're God's chosen people. That is so far from the truth. And that is such a dangerous way of thinking because, one, we're not. I mean, plain and simply. You know, if, you know, there is one way to become part of God's chosen people today. You know, and when you look at our nation, that is not what is going on. That is not what has happened. You know, and I think especially coming into the season that we are coming to now, and I don't want this to get into a political discussion, but I mean, I think some of these ideas are so hot right now because we are in such a political season as a culture that it's so easy to see these things posted, and it's so easy to hear these things, you know, among other people and among other friends. And I think we need to be cautious of that, you know, and not afraid to stand up and talk about these things with people. What a great opportunity we can have right now in teaching people. As we get into seasons like this, to bring them to the truth and say, let's talk about that. What do we mean? And go from there. So, we talked about Nahum, reminding the people of Nineveh about Nahum in chapter 3, verse 8. So, what was the point of that? What was the point of him reminding them about that?
It seems he's reminding them, you remember what you did to Thebes? What I'm going to do to you is going to be much worse.
Yeah. I think how often can we have reminders like that? That you think you are so great, you think you are so mighty, and look what you did there. And now, Nineveh, it is going to be so much worse for you than what you did over there. And, God is greater than anything. God is greater than everyone. And I think that's a good reminder for us as we go through our lives and face the different situations that we could face. So how does seeing God's vengeance and wrath affect in... How did I write that? That's weird. I don't even know what I was saying there. Okay, so seeing God's vengeance and wrath in this book, how does that affect us today? I think I put too many different words in there.
You just transposed the two effects.
I did, yes. Yeah, so how does it affect us today? And should that be any different than his grace and mercy?
So I'm afraid it doesn't affect us. That's the problem.
Yeah.
It should affect us. It's like, the earlier question, what will these lessons mean to this generation? Well, I'm afraid they mean nothing. But what should they mean? It should mean a lot. It should mean that we understand that God has a place in what happens in the nations of men. And so, I think, there's some incredible lessons that we need to draw from this. God sees what's going on. And he knows what is happening to his people today. There's not the nation of Israel as in the physical nation, but there is the nation of Israel, the spiritual Israel.
Yeah.
And God sees what's happening to his people.
I think at times, and I said this on Sunday, we can have such a misunderstanding of God's grace and his mercy, and I would even say his love, the depth of his love. I don't know if I will fully understand his grace and mercy until I stand before him in judgment. I think a lot of us would say that. And I would say it's the same about his vengeance and his wrath, that I don't think we have a true grasp of what that means and how that can affect all of us, at some point, Tim.
Well, an old preacher wrote a book not long ago called Celebrate the Wrath of God. Appreciate the discipline of God in your life. He tells us about it throughout the scriptures and warns us of his wrath. But this guy says you should celebrate his wrath because it will bring you to humility and obedience. It's an excellent book.
One of the things, what you were just saying made me think of this. I heard Paul Earnhardt was a good friend of my family for long before I was born. But I heard him say many years ago how much he looks forward to being in heaven, not just to be reunited with loved ones, but to be away from sin. And he said, and I don't mean everybody else's sin, I mean my own sin. and what a comforting thought that can be for us. You look at these people and how vile they were, and yet we can have such a hard time seeing the own challenges that we have in our own lives and the things that we face. Joe, do you have anything for
Yeah, I do.
Sunday?
Have some outlines here for Sunday. We'll be starting Hosea. Sure you get an outline.